Hello, everyone. I am delighted to kick us off and to welcome you all here today. My name is Elisabeth Jacobs. I am the Acting Executive Director of WorkRise and a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute. I want to start just by thanking you for joining us. It's lunchtime, or not so far off from lunchtime. If you're sitting here eating your lunch, I hope you enjoy, and we'll keep you busy, keep your mind working. I'm very excited to be able to jointly present today with the Roosevelt Institute new work from economists Suresh Naidu and Sojourner that challenges a dominant narrative about skills shortages as the primary driver of stagnating wages, economic inequality, and mobility. Their new report, just out, Employer Power and Employee Skills, Understanding Workforce Training Programs in the Context of Labor Market Power, forces us to rethink the role of workforce training programs as possible levers for narrowing economic inequality and expanding worker voice, representation, and bargaining power in the labor market. Suresh and Aaron's report situates workforce training in the context of larger debates on the root causes of inequality across income, wages, race, gender, in the labor market, as well as labor market power imbalances between employers and their employees. And in the context of COVID-19, these questions take on new relevance as both the public and private sector are considering major new investments in training programs to help dislocated workers. Convening this important conversation here today furthers the mission of WorkRise, which is a research to action network hosted by the Urban Institute that I hope launch this fall. WorkRise takes a big tent, multi-stakeholder approach to understanding labor market challenges and developing evidence around promising solutions, particularly in light of COVID-19's devastating impact on workers. And our big tent includes many partners, including the Roosevelt Institute, whose think tank is advancing a comprehensive agenda to structure markets and to restructure markets and the broader economy. Suresh and Aaron's paper was produced in partnership with Roosevelt's Education, Jobs, and Worker Power program, which focuses on policies aimed at dismantling structural barriers in higher education and the labor market, and ensuring that these institutions promote shared prosperity. So I'm now going to take a moment to introduce our speakers, which is why you're all here. I'll start with Suresh Naidu. Suresh is a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute and a professor in economics and international affairs at Columbia University. Aaron Sojourner is a labor economist and associate professor at the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. Amanda Cage is the president and CEO of the National Fund for Workforce Solutions. I'll say also that she's a member of WorkRise's leadership board, so I'm delighted to have her here. Lenore Friedlaender is assistant to the president at 32BJ SEIU, a local chapter of the Service Employees International Union based in New York. And Howard Rothschild is the president of the Realty Advisory Board on Labor Relations, a multi-employer association serving the real estate industry in New York City and surrounding areas. So before we get started, a little bit of Zoom housekeeping, which I'm sure all of you have been through before. I want to encourage you all to submit questions in the question and answer box, not in the chat. I will repeat that because it's a little bit different than how webinars sometimes work. Please put your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat function. We'll post a link to the report in the chat if you'd like to catch up on that. And we'll have time for Q&A at the end. I encourage you to submit those questions. But now I'm going to turn it over to Suresh, who's going to get started with Aaron presenting their findings and kick off our discussion for today.
I think I'm just going to, when I get back into real life, I'm just going to start saying like, oh, you're muted. And so can I get the slides? There we go. So the motivation for this report basically started with an observation from people in Roosevelt and the Gates Foundation that there was a large community, and I think this a lot of the people in the audience are part of this community, that is really sort of oriented around workforce development and is informed by kind of a policy discourse around the skills gap. And so this is a graph from Google Ngrams that kind of shows the occurrence of the phrase skills gap in books over time. And you actually have books in the 1970s called things like Richard Freeman wrote a book called The Overeducated American. And then that very quickly changed in the 1980s to this view that like skills were in short supply. And that's also roughly when the college to high school relative share starts slowing down. And so there's this real kind of growth in this idea that what workers lack is skills. Next slide. And in particular, since during the Great Recession, we kind of had this real resurgence in this discourse, and the evidence kind of driving it is kind of what we sort of call the shifts in the Beveridge curve. So in 2001, you have a vacancy to unemployment rate of around 4%. The vacancies fall a lot into the Great Recession, and the unemployment rate rises a lot. But then when the vacancies come back to their 2001 level in 2015, you still haven't hit the same unemployment level. And so that made a lot of people, very prominent economists, say in kind of the 2013 to 15 range that, oh, these jobs are not coming back. We're worried about kind of the permanent joblessness, and that many workers, that the jobs lost in the Great Recession will just never coming back. And I think we saw that in 2019, that as the unemployment rate approached 3%, that was probably not true. That in fact, we could get the unemployment rate down really low, even though there wasn't any kind of giant expansion of skill in the interim. Next slide. So part of the report was kind of just trying to unpack what do people mean when they talk about a skills gap. So generically, you can think of it as like a shortage of general skills that particularly like low-wage workers don't have the skills employers want, and so employers are constrained by the availability of skills in the by the workforce that's available to them, and that leads to one set of policy prescriptions. Another one is kind of this idea of mismatch, that there's workers in particular areas that are not necessarily well suited for the jobs that they're in, and so it's a solution kind of matching worker skills to the places and employers that need them. And then also there's this general idea that the robots are coming, and that sort of increased and rapid technological change implies that the skill and retraining programs are really important, because we're going to have to be buffered against this future hurricane of technologies that's coming our way. Next slide. So so in the academic variant of this, which doesn't really have the language of skills gap in any way, but the closest analog is kind of coming from the skill, what we sort of call skill bias technical change. And with just the idea that the basic determinant of inequality is in the labor market is the different returns to skill. And so if you have the college premium is the additional wages that a college grad makes relative to a high school grad. And it was pointed out in sort of some very seminal research that the relative wages of college grads relative to high school graduates moves inversely with the relative supply of college grads, all else equal. And so basically when we slowed down the rate of college attainment, what we saw is that the return to college went up in the 1980s. And an important kind of version of this is that if technological and organizational change becomes really rapid, because technological change favors the educated, this relative wage of college grads is going to just go up, and so inequality is going to get a lot worse. And like I said earlier, there was a lot of concern after the Great Recession that jobs would not come back, and so there was a lot of blame put on the education system, that either our public schools are failing, which is kind of a perennial concern in the U.S., but also kind of this concern that there's too much emphasis put on college degrees, not enough emphasis put on community college and apprenticeships and other pathways towards skill. It is real that the rate of return to college increased a lot in the 80s and 90s. And it is also true that college attainment slowed down. But it's also true that since 2000, at least, there's been kind of a plateau in the college premium, and the college non-college wage gap is no longer such a big contributor to inequality as it was in the 80s and 90s. Next slide. So what's not a solution to this is employers' provision of training. And it's kind of an old classic literature in economics, and we're not inventing anything new. We're kind of surveying it in this report. And the old literature kind of talks about this question of general versus specific training. And this is what Gary Becker kind of emphasized in his discussions of training. And what Becker noticed is that if the labor market is competitive, then if firms are offering general training, that will be offset by these lower wages for the trained workers. And at the extreme, you can think of there being very specialized firms called colleges that workers are paying in exchange for the skills that they're obtaining. And at the other extreme, you can have that the kind of training that firms are going to pay for is only going to be the kinds of training that are not portable. So firms are going to pay for the kinds of training that are firm specific and specialized, because if they invest anything that, because workers have no incentive to pay for acquiring firm specific skills, and firms have no incentive to invest in general skills because those workers will just take that value, will kind of appropriate all that value and leave to competitors. Next slide. So that's the perfectly competitive view of training. What we try to do in this paper is bring kind of a modern monopsony lens to the question of training. And in sort of, the classic idea of monopsony is that there's a company town, there's one like coal mining company that employs everybody. But the modern theory of monopsony is much closer to the turnover wage trade-off. So think of every employer has got to make a decision about, if I wiggle the wage, I'm going to, change who quits and how frequently they quit and how easy it is to recruit new workers. And so that means that every employer is kind of facing some trade-off of, do I, pay a high wage and have really low turnover, or do I pay a low wage and have and bear really high turnover? And every employer is going to be willing to bear some extra turnover in order to save on payroll. And that's kind of a view of modern monopsony that doesn't rely on there being like company towns or even very concentrated labor markets. It's just that employers are facing kind of a wage turnover trade-off. And when you have this kind of trade-off, so that you don't lose all of your workers when you lower your wage by 1%, so you lose some, but you keep most, your employers are now willing to provide some general training because they know that like at least some of their workers will not leave. And so you'll get that that employers will be willing to provide some forms of general training, think college credits or something like that, because they know that the value of that will not just disappear to other employers. But it also means that employers are going to be designing training programs to try to retain the most productive workers at a lower wage. And so there's going to be always kind of a way to use training programs to kind of solve this retention turnover problem while economizing on the wage. And it also means that when employers are facing this kind of wage turnover trade-off, they're always going to face shortages of skill, effort, and bodies. So a monopsonistic employer is always like, oh, I wish I could get more workers. I wish I could get more skill. I wish my workers would work harder, but is not willing to pay the wage to get that. And that's kind of the like from the perspective of a monopsonistic employer, it always looks like there's a shortage, but they're not willing to raise the wage to address that shortage. And that's kind of like a signature. In some ways, it's taught in graduate schools, like, oh, that's the signature of monopsony, is an employer that's complaining about shortages, but not willing to raise the wage. And that's because you're profiting from the gap between the productivity and wages of your incumbent workers. And so instead, employers will ask the public and they will ask philanthropists to increase the supply of skilled workers they want, holding the wage constant. Next slide. So the next thing we do in the report is kind of survey some of the literature on training. It's a selective survey. Other academic surveys abound. This is a thick literature. But you know, if you want to think about two approaches that are solutions, one is to approach one, which is these government provided training programs. So think Job Corps, think of things funded by the Workforce Investment Act. And so the evidence on this is mixed, but generally does not point to big gains. So I think there's, you know, you can find effects for subpopulations from particular things, but there's been a long kind of list of randomized experiments kind of looking at these training programs, and they haven't pointed to like really huge wins. On the other end of this are what are called sectoral employment programs, which are recent, kind of in the last decade and a half. And they're kind of not just train and that's it. They instead are kind of very carefully curated. So they screen workers. They provide coaching to help workers keep their jobs. They provide job search assistance. And then they're also really tailoring the skills that they're giving workers to what employers, what a set of employers want. And so they adjust the mix of what the training program is based on kind of input, working very closely with employers. And some of these show very big sustained gains. So some show like 20% earnings increase, like out to 9 years. Next slide. So the ones that show very big sustained gains are things like Perscolas, the Wisconsin, I'm going to forget what this acronym means, but this Wisconsin Industrial Training Program, and Work Advance. And we definitely want to flag that some of the ones that show larger gains are done in partnerships with unions and worker and community orgs. So both the WIRP and Project Quest are done kind of with a lot of union involvement. And we kind of want to take that, and Aaron will talk more about that, about kind of the importance of kind of getting worker organizations involved in training programs. But it's also the case that some of them are in sectors where there's like either like a formal licensing requirement and or like explicit employer collusion. So Project Quest is a great program, shows really sustained returns, but it's it's WRTP, and it's run by WIRP. The Project Quest is interesting in the sense that it showed these very long gains, and the New York Times was running pieces about the upward mobility that was generated by Project Quest. But at the same time, the same hospitals that were employing graduates of Project Quest, which is a healthcare credentialing program, were settling an antitrust lawsuit with SEIU for collusion and setting nurse wages. And so you can have, and that's important because you can still have really high returns in a context where employers are colluding or there's a cartel. But what that means is that the jobs are going to be rationed. So like you might see really great gains for the training program recipients, but there's only like a finite number of jobs. And so it's kind of part of that effect is coming because of, the people that didn't get the training are having a harder time getting a job. And so that's difficult to rule out with experiments, but it's one direction we point to for further research. Next slide. And so this is kind of a schematic of what sectoral employment programs look like. They screen workers. They often ask for workers to have some basic already have some basic skills, and what they're trying to close is like and it's a substantial chunk of workers that are could be quite productive workers, but for some reason have not like jumped into or made a connection to an employer and a good job. And then it provides training, and then it provides placement referrals, and those go to employers. And then there's kind of ongoing coaching to kind of maintain that relationship. And sometimes it includes things like providing childcare, helping with commutes, various sort of wraparound services. And we sort of flag in the program that the wraparound services seem to be really, really important for making these programs work. And that's kind of suggests that it's not skill per se that's making these programs, or it's not only skill per se that's making these programs work. It's this whole kind of whole worker approach. So I think I now will hand it off to Aaron to talk about the unions part of this.
Yeah, if you could go to the next slide, please. So, you know, in the report, we also kind of contrast and compare investments in training programs versus in unions, for instance, and what are the effects. And this is a simplified schematic here, but the basic point is that both of them lift low-wage workers' compensation among participants, those who are treated, but they tend to have different spillover effects on workers who are not participants. So as Suresh was just alluding to, if there's rationing of jobs, you might see participants getting really big gains in training programs, and you might see the control group, sort of suffering from that loss of access to those jobs. And so it might make the effects look really big, but there's some crowding out there. And I think another fundamental point is that, and difference here is that training programs, it's very much focused on expanding the size of the pie and not really altering, in many cases, when this is not designed intentionally not necessarily making sure that workers are getting a big slice of that pie that's growing, and shifting the balance of bargaining power. So, while workers at the bottom of the wage distribution might be having a larger piece of pie, the people who own the companies are also getting big chunks of that gain too, and it's not really closing. If you care about inequality per se, it's not actually really mitigating inequality. It's can be reinforcing inequality or expanding it. And especially in situations where the institutions of the training program are set up in a way that allows the employer to claim a big share of the gains, a bigger share of the gains, rather than the workers. On the other hand, think about unions. So if a group of workers unionize, they're going to get, their wages might go up the same amount, their compensation might go up the same amount, but workers in the same labor market, their employers might get nervous about the possibility of their workers unionizing, and the union might have new resources to send out organizing staff, and so there's threat effects. There's sort of positive spillovers often, where non-union workers in the same labor market see wage increases and compensation increases, even if they aren't directly members of the union. And unionization can increase productivity. I think sometimes it does, and sometimes it decreases productivity. And I think on average, the literature points to, about 0, maybe a small productivity increase. But a lot of what it does is basically shift the bargaining power. So people who own companies, they have collective bargaining agents working for them, the investors, that they're called managers. They, represent the collective interests of the owners of the business, and they negotiate with workers, they negotiate with customers, they negotiate with suppliers. And so, in creating more balanced bargaining between workers and owners means that the workers can get a bigger slice of the pie, a bigger share of the pie. And that does, it doesn't necessarily change labor market inequality, but it does change overall income inequality in the economy by shifting some of that value that's created in the job from the owners, which tend to be very concentrated. Business ownership is highly concentrated towards working families, which are highly diffuse. So if you could please move forward. So with that in mind, I said a lot of these things already. So, if you're, to the extent as a philanthropist or a policymaker, if your goal is, you can think about different goals. One goal is to raise the income and compensation of workers. A related but different goal is to reduce income inequality. And those aren't the same. But if your goal is the latter, think about increasing worker bargaining power as a key piece of that, of the strategy to get there. If you could please advance. So what does it mean in practice to think about designing workforce development programs that are aware of labor market power? So we have a set of recommendations in the report, and I'll just give you a quick overview here. We would encourage philanthropists and policymakers to invest in sectoral employment programs, in skill building programs, along with all the associated services that make it easier for workers to harness competition between employers. So the fact that a worker has access to childcare and has access to transportation and has access to job search assistance and has a portable credential that's valued across multiple employers, all of those things mean they're can harness competition and can bargain for higher share of the value that they create. And if they have access to collective action institutions that allow them to, create some shared identity and act together in the firm, in the industry, in the community, in politics, like they can then, bargain for even bigger shares of those. So trying to support institutions exemplified sort of at the extreme by unions, but not necessarily limited only to unions, to build mechanisms into training programs that intentionally try to rebalance bargaining power in the labor market. So, conditioning subsidies on boosting trainees' earnings by, target percentages. So really focusing on the performance in terms of raising compensation, increasing the starting wage over time, having accountability mechanisms built in and enforcing that. Looking for and supporting institutions, prioritizing training programs that are co-governed with worker representatives. And again, I think the joint labor management partnerships with organized labor and organized employers, organized capital in a sense, sitting down together and finding solutions that work for that sector in terms of what kind of skills are needed, what kind of training is needed, but also having a established relationship to bargain over how are the gains from those skill increases shared, and a flexible way to deal with shocks that hit the industry. That's a huge thing with COVID that we've seen across many industries is, we have, if there's not a worker institution there at the table, then the employers really have a lot of freedom to, reconfigure the deal. And it's very hard for workers to adjust and keep hold of what they've created and what they will continue to create. And so having a preference for institutions and co-governed institutions that include worker representatives and more powerful worker representatives will ensure that not only that the design of the programs meet not just employer needs, but also worker needs, but also that the gains from those new skills and new mobility will be shared more equitably. So yeah, maximizing the probability they open doors for participants, and just like having having a generally skeptical eye towards training that is just purely employer-led, that's purely, you know, single employer or few employers valuing the credential. I think a lot of this is not news to a lot of you. I mean, if you're in this field, you've thought about a lot of these issues for a long time. I don't know if, I mean, the sectoral employment programs, I think I'll amend, friendly amendment on Suresh's claim earlier. I mean, I think there's a long history with those going back, you know, many decades in different versions, maybe under different names. But I think what's new here, what we've tried to add, is this notion of monopsonistic competition, which really speaks to, you know, there's kind of two possible equilibria. One where sort of low quality jobs, low wage, high turnover jobs, one with, or you can have kind of high quality, low turnover, high compensation jobs. And we want to, you know, invest in and support and research and develop evidence on how to support sort of high quality jobs and careers. And we think that these are, you know, being attentive to the power arrangements, and it is an important way to do that. Like looking beyond training, just to quickly to say, you know, there are a lot of resources that go into training, and but again, if you care about inequality and you care about worker well-being, you can also think more expansively about other policy levers, including supporting worker organizing and supporting expansionary monetary and fiscal policy that sort of generates high labor demand, high pressure labor markets where workers have more bargaining power. You know, since the mid 70s, we've had a very small share of our time where labor markets have been operating at high pressure. And, you know, so if you're a work first person and you're committed to that, no big deal. That's, you know, for somebody else. But if you're coming from a different perspective, a philanthropist who's interested in these issues, like those are alternative vehicles to think about rebalancing. Okay, thank you. I think that's what we got.
Excellent. Thank you both. There's so much food for thought here. And as you both were speaking, I was thinking about how much I love my job because both in this context, but also more broadly, to be able to bring a conversation and an academic presentation about monopsony and multiple equilibrium, and then turn it over to a panel that includes practitioners, union advocate, and employer, and really bring that down to ground and see how it resonates is just like, it's really exciting. And I'm excited to hear the conversation amongst the panelists. So I'm gonna kick it off to our panelists by just to get a sense from all of you whether the analysis that Suresh and Aaron just presented on the relationship between labor market power and workforce training, how that resonates with your reality. So what real world evidence do you see to either confirm or refute their hypothesis that the labor market context in which training programs operate really determines the success of those programs for workers and for the economy more generally? Or just to put it a different way, what does your experience on the ground tell you are the primary determinants of economic inequality or the key levers for raising wages? So big picture question, really asking you to reflect on what you just heard and how it resonates with your everyday reality and your work. So I'm going to start with Amanda, just because A is the first letter in the alphabet, and then we'll give everyone a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, I think, you know, I always want to say at the beginning of these conversations, when we're talking about workforce development, just to set the stage, that we do need to acknowledge that workforce training is woefully underfunded in this country. We spend about 0.1% of our GDP on workforce development compared to other countries that spend 2 to 3% of their GDP. When it comes to industrialized country, the only country that spends less money than us is Mexico. That said, I agree, we can't train our way out of this crisis. One of the things that we have is really a proliferation of low wage and low quality jobs. Half of the workers in this country work in low wage, low quality jobs. And there's a host of reasons for that, right? Global competition, automation, shareholder primacy, and yes, declining unionization. So workforce development and training programs can't be the panacea for that. But we can figure out ways to make workforce training programs better. There's union-run training programs. They're ubiquitous in the building trades. Hotel workers, for example, have a culinary academy in Las Vegas that is the envy of the hospitality industry in the world. I've had personal experience with SEIU healthcare training programs, both on the West Coast and in New England. And then there's ways that we can think about sectoral approaches. In my organization, we run a network of about 30 collaboratives around the country and that make up sort of workforce development practitioners. And a key element to those programs is industry partnerships. So industry partnerships in healthcare, construction, manufacturing, IT, where employers have come together and said, we need to work on our human capital problems together. And over the last 10 years, we've really been able to outline what are some of the best practices around those industry partnerships. In fact, we just came out with a toolkit, and I can drop it in the chat at some point. But we know some things really matter. Having employer engagement with employers who are willing to change their internal practices based on what they find out. Really bringing together other stakeholders, so community colleges, workforce boards, economic development organizations, bringing them together to focus on the issues and align their strategies, that they have data-informed strategies. I've sat in a lot of rooms of manufacturers who are like trying to find CNC machinists, and they need 50 and they're all fighting over the same 5, right? And so really understanding what the supply is out there and what they're competing for. And that folks get together on a regular basis and not just one-offs, not when there's a big public project that needs to have this many workers, but really thinking through that pipeline all the way through. And then finally, really focusing on racial equity and inclusion. We know all of these issues aren't, sort of race neutral, that they're people of color sort of bear the brunt of the low wage, low quality job phenomenon. And so really thinking about those disparate impacts when creating and cultivating those programs.
Howard, I'm going to turn to you next.
My experience really is as a trustee of some training funds. So the employers that are members of our organization are typically in unionized environments, and there's generally in those collective bargaining agreements mandated money that goes for training, and it's usually a factor of a certain amount per hour or per week or per year or whatever. That then funds a whole pocketbook of funds that can be used for a wide variety of things. And ultimately it goes for sector training. And what that does is it creates portability for the union members, so that if they get trained, they can, and there's no openings at their current employer, they can go to a different employer. And oftentimes seniority will go across company lines so that they don't lose paid time off and things like that. The other thing that those types of funds do is the very structure leads to, I think, a wide variety of discussions that would otherwise not take place. So, for example, we have trustees as part of the fund. There are management trustees, there are union trustees, and then even down a level, there's a curriculum committee on each of the funds. Lenore and I chair the curriculum committee on the 32BJ training fund called the Shortman Fund. But it's not just Lenore and I. There are union members on the fund. There are union officials on the fund. There's management on the fund. There's ownership on the fund. And then overall, there are fund professionals that can make sure that the ideas that come out of the curriculum committee then get implemented. So for example, at any time on the 32BJ fund, there are about 150 or 160 different courses that a union member can take free of charge. And generally that training falls into three categories. There might be training that's mandated by the government. So for example, in New York, we just had about a year ago, mandated training for sexual harassment, or they might be training that an employee needs a particular license for their particular job. And that might be government mandated, or it might be mandated by the employer. And then the vast majority of courses are voluntary courses that an employee can take. And so I've seen really the effects of this. I've been in the industry about almost 40 years, where people can move from job to job. Maybe they were a new immigrant to this country. They didn't even speak English. Well, we have training. The most popular course, English as a second language. And that doesn't help the person in their job. It will help them outside their job as well. And so people can take this training. It's free. There's an incentive for them to do it, and they can get promoted. So clearly, in my mind, the sector training is much better. And my limited experience at this is these training funds, and they have had remarkable success.
Great. Lenore.
Thank you. Really interested in the presentation and the issue that the hypothesis that the labor market context has a huge impact on the success of training programs. We really subscribe to that. Training doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in the current economic framework and the economic model that exists in this country. Workers, experience their job holistically, as do employers. And so just separating out training and just thinking about training we don't believe is enough. Appreciate Amanda sharing some of those statistics, because that's the world that we live in. Many of us live in. And I just want to give a really concrete example, kind of two different examples about this point. One is our union undertook a massive organizing campaign of office cleaners or janitors in New Jersey in 2000. We noticed that some of the same building owners, some of the same real estate companies had buildings in New York and New Jersey. They had some of the same cleaning companies in New York and New Jersey. Somehow the same people performing the same work for the same company in a building owned by the same company, those workers were getting minimum wage in New Jersey, but they were getting a decent wage with benefits in New York. It wasn't a question of training. It was a question of whether workers were organized and had the bargaining power to change their situation. And we were able to organize the entire industry. took the approach not of organizing work site by work site or company by company, but saying we have to set a new standard. The non-union standard is minimum wage with almost no benefits, but we can raise the floor by organizing and setting a new standard. And we actually bargained an agreement with all the employers together. And the goal was to kind of raise a standard and make it fair for employers so that there was a level playing field, fair competition, to take wages and benefits out of competition, and kind of change the model. And in our first agreement, the workers' wages went, most people were making $5.25 an hour. By the end of the first agreement, they were making $9.75 an hour. And today, a little less than 20 years later, they're making between $16 and $18 an hour. And in our first agreement, we were able to bargain not only health benefits, but the training school that Howard talked about, which is an awesome benefit, and a legal services benefit. And so people's lives have been transformed. The employers, the real estate industry has continued to be profitable, and it is fair for employers. So that, and it has made a difference for thousands and thousands of workers. And the point about the ripple effect also is true, that in the non-union world, driving wages up, there are employers who think about, okay, the union rate where there's an industry established rate is this. I have to raise my wages in order to either discourage people from forming a union or keep my employees working for me, because people will gravitate where there are better jobs. And then having the union allows the kind of communication that Howard talked about, so we can talk about, well, what is it that the workers need? Do they need English? Do they need customer service? Do they need, what skill set do they need? What about green cleaning? When green chemicals were first introduced and people didn't like it because they couldn't smell the bleach, and it was like, how do we handle those kinds of situations? It's like where we can talk back and forth. We have an open space where we can discuss what's needed, what employers need, how the industry is changing, what workers need, what concerns they have, and workers can speak up without fear of losing their job, saying, hey, I don't have enough gloves, or hey, this cleaning, does this cleaning chemical really work? Or, there's a place for that kind of a discussion in a partnership. So that's one example of sort of how collective bargaining at an industry or sectoral level, also as Howard and Suresh and Aaron talked about, can really make a difference. The second thing is the Fight for 15 campaign has, really kind of spoken to economic inequality in this country, but it's also led to legislative changes. And most recently in Florida, passed a $15 an hour minimum wage. And so those kinds of things also, what is the legal and regulatory environment? How do those things change the quality of jobs, and how does public policy have an impact here? So it's not just what employers are doing, what unions are doing, but also what government is doing, or what is the legal and regulatory environment that we exist in.
Great. So I'm going to turn it back to Amanda with her field-wide view to see if she can give us some reflections on programs run by industry worker partnerships, like the specific one that Lenore and Howard have been describing, and programs that are run only by a single worker organization or just by industry. Because the unique thing about this is that we've got both of these folks at the table who've been working together from very different perspectives. So I wonder if you can say a little bit about that versus some of the other efforts.
Sure, and I think it would be helpful for folks to understand how most workforce training happens in this country. So it's very much a you're on your own kind of system, right? For those of us who are in the workforce development profession, what it looks like often is we have, sort of job seekers who come into our programs. We do as much as we can to educate folks with labor market information so they understand the labor market and what jobs are out there and what they look like. We present to them a catalog of trainers that they can like pick and choose from. And then, we have relationships with employers, and we try to get them to match with those employers. And at every stage of that, we lose people, right? People fall through the cracks. Life happens. It turns out a lot of training programs, the concept, it's on your own time, on your own dime, and people have other competing things that are happening in their lives. One of the things that's so sort of special about the program that Lenore and Howard described is that it's very clear to the people who are involved what is happening with them. Oftentimes it's spelled out in a collective bargaining agreement, right? So a worker can kind of look at their union contract and say, oh, look, I can get time at work, at my job, to get trained. If I get trained on my job, I understand the clear pathway to promotion. I can see exactly the pay differential I'm going to get. All that information is transparent. And that's incredibly important. It's very efficient in that way. You're not sort of guessing. You're not sort of thinking, oh, maybe I'll try to, what we used to describe in workforce development as train and pray. You kind of like put all your time and effort into a training program and hope that you get a job, and you hope you get a job that pays you more. So, there really is value in the kind of, sort of labor, sort of management programs that focus on training. That said, 90% of workers in this country don't belong to a union. And even at the height of the union movement, 2/3 of workers didn't have a union, right? So we really do have to think about other ways to get worker voice involved in creating training programs that work for workers, understanding better what those work supports are. I appreciated in the research the focus on work supports. What are those wraparound services that people really need to be able to succeed? What's the difference between that and the skills training? Like it is some combo together that really makes it meaningful for workers. And so I think there's a challenge for us as a field to figure out how to engage that worker voice.
Great. So Lenore, you're a member of New York City's Workforce Development Board. So that means you've seen up close which programs work or are more effective than others. How do you think training programs should be designed to really ensure that workers benefit as much from their new skills as the employers do who are looking for those specific skills for their work? How can training actually increase worker bargaining power, I guess, is another way of asking that same question.
I think one of the things that we believe strongly is training works best when it's tied to a good job. When it is, so, if you look at the construction unions and the building trades world, they have training and apprentice programs where there's a school part, an on-the-job classroom part, and an on-the-job training part, and they generally last 2 to 5 years. And the apprentice programs, the number of people that are taken into the apprentice programs is based on what the union projects for that particular trade, the need for union, iron workers or carpenters or painters or electricians or whatever is. So the more good jobs are created, the more openings the training and apprentice programs have to train people. We have the same kind of a program for window cleaners. It's a lot shorter, it's 18 months, but it's the same type of deal, that there are more training opportunities, and training can be targeted, and the building trades in New York and other places are really doing this, thinking about how do they bring in communities of workers of color, formerly incarcerated, non-traditional workers like women, returning vets, et cetera, and create special pre-apprentice programs to make sure that they have the skills to be successful. And there's an awesome program in New York City where public housing residents have a direct access and a certain amount of jobs set aside to create pipelines to good jobs that are union jobs that are also safe jobs. So in the construction industry, there are some really good models. We like this sectoral approach, and we love our training program, and we value the partnership with the employers. One of the things that makes it work is that the employers in our industry have kind of a sense of a social contract and a commitment to the long-term, to the employees long-term. And I know there was some discussion in the presentation about high turnover and the cost of turnover. One of the values is it's like to invest in workers. You want to invest in them for a career, not just for, who can vacuum today, who can pick up the trash today, who can, be on a security post today, who can, push a wheelchair in an airport today, and who cares who it is tomorrow. That sort of changing the dynamic so there's a long-term commitment to employees in an industry and to the economic well-being in the industry, including the well-being of the workers who create the value for the employers. So that, that commitment translates not only into training, but translates into healthcare, retirement, paid time off, labor management committees to discuss whatever issues may come up. It's a different approach that says we want to increase value. We don't want to cut costs. So it's a very different kind of a model. So we subscribe to this idea of sort of sectoral multi-employer approach to create a higher floor through collective bargaining and legislative action, eliminating barriers to unionization. And there are lots of different ways to do that but really promoting and encouraging unionization of labor peace, labor neutrality, and other things that make it easy for workers to organize, incentivize collective bargaining rather than de-incentivize collective bargaining.
So I'm going to turn the flip side of that question to Howard. So one of the recommendations from Erin and Suresh is developing these joint labor management training programs that are sector rather than firm focused, because they might benefit business too, ? Are there ways that you can describe based on your experience with your work and observations beyond that, if you want to stretch it, as to how these sectoral training and how programs that emphasize worker power, worker bargaining actually benefits employers as well as the workers?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily start off with worker power and worker bargaining. To me, it's a win-win situation, right? It's a win for the workers, but it's also a win for the employers, because if you have a multi-employer bargaining and you have collective bargaining agreements with a union or unions, you get an efficiency of scale that you could never get if any particular company did it on their own. So, so I think I briefly described the Shortman Training Fund of 160 courses or 150 courses. I think the total cost to the employer is $170 a year for that, per employee. The employer could never do that. And because there are paid professionals with these training funds, and because they're highly astute and highly responsive to the union, their members, to us and our members. So now COVID-19 hits, okay? We never experienced COVID-19 before. All of a sudden, we needed a disinfection course for COVID-19. We needed a customer service course for COVID-19. How do you get your employees to tell the tenants in the building, you better put on a mask, miss or sir, and not piss them off, right? And then perhaps cause that worker to be in harm's way, whether it's a health issue or maybe it becomes a disciplinary issue. Security guards at the front, they have to screen people differently. People's temperatures have to be taken. You need deep cleaning courses, and you need to do it on a dime. And so So for example, I got a call from one of our larger employers. They have about 5,200 local 32 BJ members. And the head of the company said to me, listen, the people I report to, they need COVID. They want us to have COVID training for our employees, and it has to be done in 3 days. And there was no such course, okay? And the Shortman Fund, within 3 days, created a course and trained 5,200 people. That would be very, very hard to do if it was one company on their own. Then the head of that company called me the following week and he said, you know, they did such a good job with that. We have another 1,200 people that aren't even in the union. Can you figure out a way how to have that course train the other 1,200 people that are in a different union? And there are all sorts of barriers, et cetera. And I called up the head of the training fund, and within 4 days, they trained another 1,200 people. So, you know, the idea that, you know, there's this efficiency of scale, I really don't think can be underscored enough. The other thing is, in terms of the employers, there are employers like to save money, okay? Employers like to do things efficiently. And through through different avenues, the 32 BJ school has created courses in response to requests by employers or new initiatives by the city. And one of the big things is to reduce the carbon footprint of buildings. In New York City, the biggest user of fuel are buildings. We have a lot of buildings. They're very tall. They're really condensed. There's not a lot of people who drive around, but buildings use a lot of fuel. And so for economic reasons, it's certainly prudent for building owners to try to use as little fuel as possible in the most efficient way. So it saves them money. That money can then be translated into different benefits of wages or benefits for employees. And so I'll give you a quick example. We got a grant from the Department of Labor a few years ago, and the Department of Labor said, we want you to train 1,000 superintendents in apartment buildings in New York on these fuel efficiency, these new fuel efficiency ways of saving fuel. The training fund got together with the employers, with the union, with their members. We didn't train 1,000 people. We had 1 year to train 1,000 people. We didn't train 1,000 people that year. We trained 2,000 people that year. Okay, clearly, again, the idea of scale is very important here. And how much again does this cost? $170 a year. You couldn't do it any other way.
Great. So I'm going to turn us to the Q&A to get some of our really large audience involved in the conversation. The funniest thing about these Zoom things is that I can see how many of you are here by looking at the participant count, but when we do these events in public, I can actually see all of your faces. So I'm sorry that I can't see you, but we have a whole bunch of questions in the Q&A, and I want to give Suresh and Aaron a chance also to come in and participate in the conversation, answering them. I'm going to actually ask the questions in batches because I've been following the Q&A as they've come in, and I think they fall under some themes. So I'm going to, if I don't get your question exactly right, it's because I'm trying to fit as much as possible into our remaining 20 minutes, 25 minutes in terms of what we touch on conversation-wise. So I'm going to start. There are a couple questions that have to do with measurement, and I want to start there because I think it'll help us get kind of crisp on what Suresh and Aaron are talking about and how when Lenore and Howard and Amanda have been talking about what they see, kind of what they're thinking. So there are two measurement questions. One is specific to the presentation. At one point, the presentation mentions big gains in programs. And so I want to throw that out both to Suresh and Aaron, but also more generally to all of you. When you think about a successful program, when you think about what you're measuring, I'm curious just to hear, to kind of level set, because we use words and sometimes we don't actually all mean the same thing. So I want to give people a chance to actually say what they mean when they're thinking of gains and outcomes. And then the other question, which I think is relevant, is a question about how many people get screened out of these sectoral training programs, how much creaming happens, and what happens to people who aren't able to participate and how that might skew the results. So again, it's a measurement question. It's also a policy question. I'll let you all maybe like raise your hands, panelists, to let me know if you want to jump in. We didn't actually discuss how we manage that, or just talk, and I think we can handle it. Yeah. Suresh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll front the measurement question. On the first one, basically the academic literature generally focuses on earnings, like wages times hours, and like that includes unemployment, 0 hours. And so that's kind of, and when we say big gains, we're kind of looking, something like Project Quest is really great. It's like 20% gains out to like 9 years after training. That's sort of what we consider like a measured success. Obviously, a job is more than earnings, but kind of the way that the academic literature is kind of focused on labor market outcomes of like wages and hours. On the screening question, that's there in the report. I think we talk about it a bit, and it's certainly there in the underlying reports describing the programs, the exact fraction that are screened. I just think so I just don't know off the top of my head the fraction that of those that applied, how many are screened, but I'm not sure that that's like an informative number, because you would need to know it's the number who applied for the program. And so you would potentially, that denominator could be a much larger population. And what you're measuring after that is like, after they're screened into the program, you're then randomizing training among those that are screened. So you still have, given that you're screened into the program, you're still seeing the difference between training and not training, but you have to worry if that same effect would like extrapolate outside of the screened population. And that's kind of the worry.
Lenore and then Amanda.
Yeah, I think, there are different models on the screening issue for different types of programs. Our training program, the one that Howard and I are involved with, any member, any worker who's employed by an employer whose union contract includes the benefit is eligible to take free classes. It's unlimited number in the years, as Howard mentioned, it's about 10 cents an hour on an hourly basis for a full-time worker. So it's free to the member. Any number, there's no barriers to entry if it's a benefit that's in their union contract. Some courses have prerequisites and requirements. And there are courses to help people be successful. So some courses require English, but we have English as a second language. And some courses are an advanced, building maintenance course that might have a basic air conditioning class as a requirement before, to take something before you take something else. One of the things that our training fund has done and been super successful at is it's oriented towards adult learning, and the fact that people have 4 different learning styles. Some people learn by reading, by listening, by touching. And so they've really done a lot of work with the instructors to make sure that the training really sticks with people, and that it's based on people's real life situations. There are a lot of, Howard mentioned the sexual harassment training. It's scenario based for our industry. So a door person, has a certain situation. The teachers draw situations from the member's lived experience or the employer's lived experience for our particular industry, and it can be adapted in that way. And so all those things make the training more successful. It's not reading for our industries. It's not reading based. It's much more practical, hands-on, participatory, small group discussion, videos, quizzes. and has, been able to continue online in the COVID era in an amazingly quick way. So there's really a commitment to adult education, makes it more successful and helps people with be successful and absorb and retain as much as possible.
Amanda.
Sure. I just wanted to address the issue of creaming. I think especially in the 80s and 90s, job training programs were like the poster child for creaming when you talked about programs. And as I mentioned earlier, the lack of funding and the lack of resources, I think in the field has really made us really prioritize who gets access to these dollars. And I think overwhelmingly that prioritization has gone to folks who are most in need and who have the most barriers. So I would say actually in workforce development as a field, there's been a more of a movement to make sure those resources go to the folks who need them the most.
Aaron.
Yeah, the question about how to measure gains and what is a big gain, you can do it. It's pretty clear with experiments. And so I think there is, that gives some claim or some warrant to do more research and do more performance evaluation and more rigorous evaluation on the ground, maybe like centralize intake and recruitment and separate that to some extent from the actual delivery of services, so that then like in a location you can have sort of centralized recruitment and intake, and then like randomly assign people out to providers and training programs from there, and or at least for a fraction, have some institution in the local market that recruits and refers, and then you can use that set of participants to contrast outcomes across providers, doing things like that. And I mean, one thing I just wanted to, part of it is going to be hard to nail down outside of the context of a ongoing random controlled trial, which is not ever something we can. It's not really something we do all the time anywhere. So part of the solution, I think, is to be mindful of these institutional design factors, because they build in assurance that more value goes to the worker. And so, absent the ability to measure these things directly, these kind of institutional design factors offer some assurance. One thing I wanted to caution against is like employers' willingness to participate, especially a particular employer's willingness to participate and sponsor and employ trainees, can be like inversely related to the benefit that the workers are going to get. So like if I'm the one hospital in town, I might be very willing to pay for training for new nurses, but it's because I know that I'm going to be able to capture a lot of the value that they create, because they don't have any other alternative potential employers to go to. So like as investors in workforce development, being mindful of not using employer willingness to participate as a proxy for this is a good idea to do it. In fact, it can often cut the opposite way. And yeah, I think that the challenges of cream skimming and the Ashenfelter dip is a famous thing in labor econ that makes it hard to know. Those are real issues, and I appreciate Amanda's point about scaling up funding. Actually, I think your colleague at WorkRise at Urban, Bill Congdon, worked on a brief at the White House Council of Economic Advisors about active labor market policies that's made a similar point. We are just way behind. So other countries in supporting active labor market policies and investing in those. So again, this is not a call to like say that this is not, I mean, we recognize that this is a valuable set of investments to make and productive set of investments to make, but we're just trying to advance some institutional design principles that are informed by like an awareness that labor markets aren't perfectly competitive. You can't just trust that the market's going to take care of distribution on its own, that actually you have to be attentive to power in the market as well.
Yeah. So I have another set of questions that are about the industries that these kind of sectoral approaches tend to work in or not. And an audience member noted that workforce development boards have typically shied away from sectoral approaches in hospitality, retail, restaurants due to concerns around all of the things you're talking about, right? And I see Amanda smiling, so I suspect she'll want to jump in on that. And the point here, which I think is a really good one, is an open question that I'll be very curious to hear all of you muse on, is we know that these are the industries that are hurting the most right now because of the nature of the labor market effects of the pandemic. As Howard noted, I think there are also industries that potentially have heavy training lifts to do right now, because even going forward, they may just look somewhat different in terms of how they operate, even once we're back in anything resembling any semblance of normal. But I'm wondering, just for your reflections on all of that, sort of how and why is there a future for sectoral approaches in some of these industries that seem like they might be the ones that need it most. And then the other industry question is one about nonprofits. And I think the idea was the role that nonprofits play as employers. And I'm curious to hear if that resonates with any of you, just in this context of how this model might work across industries. So Amanda, given that you smiled big, so I might let you jump in first, and then if anyone else wants to answer, they can.
I worked on a project a couple years back that really focused on this exact issue. We worked with 10 workforce boards around the country to say, you know, when workforce boards have adopted sectoral approaches, why is it, you know, sort of retail and hospitality, why do they not like sort of make the cut? And there are lots of reasons for that. I'll talk a little bit about the ramifications of the fact that they don't make the cut. And the first and foremost is it is an industry that is way overrepresented by people of color, right? So there you've taken an industry where we have concentrated a lot of Black workers, a lot of Latin workers, a lot of immigrant workers, and said on some level, like, we're not going to deal with that, right? And that has real implications for folks, some of which we are experiencing in this very present moment, where we have that industry experiencing mass disruption and not having the same kind of response that manufacturing or construction or healthcare or all those other sort of industries that we think of, you know, having economic multipliers and all of those fancy things do. One of the things that we're working on right now, and I do think it's critical to think about, we were starting to see this in, you know, in sort of retail already as bricks and mortar sort of started to shrink way before the pandemic. And now we're seeing that same kind of tsunami hit the hospitality sector, is really trying to think about the service sector writ large, right? That there are so many transferable skills, and, you know, in workforce development, we love that phrase, transferable skills, right? That people can take from these industries. And we've seen real concrete models of this. You know, if you are thinking of retail as being a cashier and you're not thinking about retail as being transportation, you know, logistics, if you're not thinking of cybersecurity, you're thinking about it wrong, because that's what retail looks like these days. And we're seeing more and more of that. So trying to figure out how people understand and engage in that service sector economy, and really, like, we have got to pay real attention to this if we want to deal with economic disparities as it relates to race in this country. We're just moving people further and further apart.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to jump in? I've got lots of other questions if if people want to give Amanda the last word on that one, but I want to be sure if folks have.
Can I jump in? Can I jump in to not answer the question?
Yes.
Okay. So I think a lot of what this what this boils down to is the relationship between labor and management. And if there's underlying distrust and miscommunication between the parties, it will invariably lead to acrimony. I'll give you a concrete example. COVID hit, and the hotel unions in New York immediately demanded an emergency arbitration and asked for all sorts of things from employers to be imposed by an arbitrator. COVID hit, and the building service union and the employers immediately picked up the phone and spoke to one another, and we continued to speak to one another every day, multiple times a day. They had their service, we had our service. We figured out ways to create agreements that made our contracts, which could not function during COVID. It's a contract written for a normal time, not a COVID time. It just couldn't apply. And so management needed certain flexibility. On the other hand, the employees and their families were suffering mightily. Some were scared to come to work. Some were furloughed from work. And so we created a series of memorandum of agreement. And we listened to each other and spoke to each other, and we made, I can't tell you how many agreements. We had numerous webinars amongst ourselves and the industry. And ultimately, I'll give you just two highlights. We created a 5-month extension for health insurance for all employees who got furloughed with no employee premium. We created a voluntary early retirement program for anyone who decided, and gave them a huge benefit over what they would have otherwise have received. We extended recall rights for a very long time. We continued their training, their rights to go for training and for the legal fund. And so a lot of this, I mean, we're focusing on training today, but a lot of this goes to the relationship between management and labor and the ability it sounds silly, to pick up the phone and call the other side and say, I got this problem. How can we find a solution to this problem? As opposed to, trying to beat the other side over the head. And this type of relationship really carries over to the training. And I think that's why the training isn't successful because we're great at training. The training is successful because we have a good relationship and we talk. It really sounds corny, but it's the truth.
Great.
Let me just chime in for a second. I think it's really interesting, right? The low wage sectors like retail and restaurants, those are exactly the sectors that have high turnover of both workers and employers. And so it's super hard to just get everyone, and they tend to be non-union. And so the idea that that is a sector that training is going to fix these issues, it's just, you got to make good, I would think that one of the precursors or something that has to come along with training, transforming these jobs, is that, you kind of actually make it that these are not just jobs, they're like job ladders, and that there's like career pathways. And so that people are think that, if I start in on the ground floor, I actually have a path here that, will let me go through my life cycle for some period of time. And that will come along with making it worthwhile to invest in training. And I think what combination of institutions it will take to take the low wage part of the labor market and make it so that you have good jobs there is complicated. But it's one of the reasons why, I know SEIU is sort of in favor of this, is these sectoral bargaining or wage boards ideas, where you're basically going to use the government, and in New York we have them for fast food, and basically like bring both sides of the table together. And what you can imagine, one of the things that gets hashed out there is the kind of thing that that Howard is talking about.
Great. So I'm going to give a lightning round last question because we have 3 minutes left, but I really want to hear your answers to this question. And then I'll wrap us up. I'm going to try and not have us go over then by any more than a minute or two. But a number of people have noted, both in the audience as well as those of you in your remarks, that unionization has declined substantially. There are many different forms of worker organizing that are taking place, in some places in collaboration with unions, in many cases it's instead of unions. And I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, and I know this isn't necessarily a rapid response answer, but your thoughts on whether there's space for non-union worker collective organization in thinking about this new framework for workforce development. So that's a yes or no version. If you want to add a few more words onto your answer, please feel free, because I know there's a lot to dig into there.
I'll jump in.
Aaron's got his hand up, so he can go first.
Thanks. Yeah, I think there is, for sure. I mean, there has to be, because, but I think the goal is to be intentional about ensuring that that voice is there and that those institutions are there and they're independent and they're real and they have some independent power in the community or in the sector or in politics. So they're not just a creature or a veneer of this, of this program or this relationship, but they're actually have some independent reality to represent workers in a meaningful way and hold the trainer and hold the employers accountable, outside of this one narrow set of issues. So I saw somebody chatted about coworker.org. I think that's a really innovative and promising site. And, I could imagine providers or training program folks like hiring coworker.org basically, or institutionalizing some relationship with coworker where coworker has access to everybody who's trained and all the employees at those places, and like starts to create some voice for those people that's independent of the employers. And you can imagine a lot of different forms. And I know, like Project Quest, there was a lot partnership for decades, with the Industrial Area Foundation. Paul Osterman's written and worked on a lot of those, and so there's a lot of lessons out there of alternative forms.
Great.
So
Amanda.
Yeah, I would say, as somebody especially who cares a lot about racial equity, we have so many workers of color who work in occupations and jobs that have fallen out of the traditional employer-employee relationship. Whether it's domestic workers or gig workers or restaurant workers or farm workers, there needs to be some response that is not just about training, that deals with the fact that those folks don't have some of the basic labor protections that the rest of us take for granted.
Great, thanks. Anyone else before I wrap us up? Last chance.
Sure, I'll jump in here. Worker organizations like day labor networks or farm worker organizations, in some cases there is collective bargaining, in some cases there isn't collective bargaining, are super important, that draw attention to problems, but don't have the same power to win lasting and permanent wage improvements or benefits or a grievance procedure or other kinds of things that can happen through collective bargaining, and can be very unstable and kind of go up and down, and don't provide the same kind of structural change, don't have the same resources to bring into the mix. So, we are strong advocates of all efforts to make collective bargaining easier, to make organizing a union easier, to support workers in their efforts to draw attention to the issues and get their issues resolved. The challenge is there's no enforcement unless there's a collective bargaining agreement or some kind of signed agreements. And sometimes there are community benefits agreements and other kinds of agreements that get entered into, but they're very project specific. They don't provide an ongoing and long-term view. They don't allow the kind of long-term planning and long-term engagement. And just as a particular example, Howard has brought up a number of the ways that the union and the employers have worked together to solve problems. One of the issues that it comes up every bargaining cycle is the cost of healthcare. And so we've actually, have a little committee that works on how to manage the cost of healthcare, because it's such a crazy, high expense where healthcare inflation is just like, going up incredibly. And there's a commitment by the employers to pay for healthcare, but we have to figure out how we get the best value and how we manage the cost. And that is a longer term project. And we look at it over the longer term rather than, what is the crisis today and how do I solve this immediate crisis?
Great.
I'll let it go.
All right, well then Howard, if you want to jump in, the employer gets the last word on worker organizing. If you want to have it, it's yours.
So, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but my last thought is I agree with Lenore, but Lenore, you cannot bring that up at the next collective bargaining session, please.
Fantastic.
He's got it on tape, Howard.
Yeah. It's been recorded, but we won't show anyone. Well, I want to thank you all, both the panelists as well as all of you who've joined us for this conversation. From both WorkRise and Roosevelt, this has been a really great way to spend a late lunch. Unfortunately for Howard, a recording of this event will be available on the Roosevelt Institute's website, rooseveltinstitute.org, shortly in the next couple of days. And we encourage you to visit Roosevelt's website as well as WorkRise's at workrisenetwork.org to learn more about both this work and lots of other related resources. I hope you all have a terrific afternoon and look forward to continuing the conversation.